The console flickered in and out, but Billy Bob didn't seem too concerned. His boots were propped up on the dashboard of the Rustbucket, the oldest, ugliest cargo hauler still limping its way through the stars. The ship creaked like an old barn in a storm, panels groaning under the mild tremors of distant asteroid collisions. The coffee in his cracked mug sloshed over the rim with every jolt, but Billy Bob simply slurped it up with a grin, savoring the bitter bite. Outside the cracked viewport, the asteroid field stretched endlessly, chunks of ancient rock spinning lazily or whirling like thrown knives. The ship's automated voice chirped a warning about incoming debris, but he waved it off like a pesky fly. Somewhere beyond those rocks, a cloaked ship lurked, its inhabitants watching him with predatory patience. The aliens aboard the sleek pirate vessel, the Skeltari, didn't bother hiding their disdain as they observed the battered human ship struggling along its route. Through the shimmering cloaks of their viewports, they exchanged smug glances, assuming it was another easy payday. Their leader, a tall, bone-thin figure named Commander Crix, clicked his mandibles in glee, already counting the spoils they'd plunder from a human fool. Inside the Rustbucket, however, Billy Bob was humming an old Earth tune, completely oblivious, or so it seemed. He tapped the side of an ancient radar screen, trying to get a better read on the field ahead, the battered equipment responding with fuzzy blips. He knew they were out there. He could feel it. Years of trucking through dangerous sectors had given him a sixth sense for when trouble was brewing. He smirked and flipped a couple of unlabeled switches on the overhead panel. Hidden compartments along the ship's hull clicked open, revealing jury-rigged cannons made from scavenged parts. He didn't know if they'd hold together long enough to fire, but it was better than nothing. Another tremor shook the ship as a massive asteroid tumbled a little too close for comfort, scraping along the shields with a screech like nails on a chalkboard. Billy Bob didn't flinch. He simply leaned forward, setting his coffee down with exaggerated care, and muttered, "All right, boys. Let's dance." In the pirate ship, alarms began to blare. The asteroid field was shifting more rapidly than predicted, forcing the Skeltari to break their formation. Commander Crix hissed in annoyance but still barked the order to attack. Fighters detached from the mothership, darting forward like a school of predators toward the lone, rickety hauler. They didn't expect resistance. They certainly didn't expect what came next. Billy Bob jammed the throttle forward, sending the Rustbucket into a spinning dive between two massive asteroids. The ship groaned like a wounded animal, but Billy Bob whooped with excitement, steering with a reckless abandon that no Skeltari simulator could have prepared them for. Makeshift cannons popped out from hidden bays and spat clouds of metallic shrapnel, peppering the nearest alien fighters and knocking two of them off course instantly. The Skeltari pilots shrieked over the comms, trying to regain control. Billy Bob, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. He steered the bulky hauler with a deftness that made it seem like an extension of his own body, weaving through rock and debris, luring the enemy ships into tighter, deadlier spaces. Another flip of a switch triggered old mining EMP charges, modified to explode with an unpredictable pattern. Several alien ships flew straight into the trap, their shields flickering and dying before they slammed into drifting boulders. Laughing to himself, Billy Bob pulled a battered cigar from his jacket and stuck it between his teeth, the end glowing as he lit it with a flick of a match against the console. The Skeltari leader growled in rage, ordering all ships to converge, but it was too late. Billy Bob juked and spun, letting two pirate fighters crash into each other as they tried to corner him. He used a dense cluster of small asteroids like a screen, disappearing behind it only to emerge moments later in a wild, spiraling corkscrew maneuver that no one thought possible for a ship that size. His engine sputtered, a few warning lights blinking madly on the dashboard, but Billy Bob barely glanced at them. "Come on, baby, hold together," he whispered to the ship as if it were a loyal horse in a gunfight. The ship answered by giving a groaning cough but kept flying. Back on the pirate bridge, Crix slammed his clawed hands into the console, furious beyond reason. This was supposed to be an easy ambush, but now half his strike team was floating wreckage, and the rest were scrambling just to avoid crashing. Worse still, the humans' cargo hauler was moving like a warship piloted by a madman. It made no sense. Humans were supposed to be primitive, weak, and predictable. Yet here, in the heart of the chaos, Billy Bob was laughing. It was a rich, genuine laugh that echoed through the Rustbucket's cabin, loud and wild, a sound that somehow cut through the void between ships. For the first time, the Skeltari felt something they weren't used to feeling when facing other species: fear. As another pirate fighter exploded behind him in a blaze of shrapnel and fire, Billy Bob tipped his hat toward the chaos, took a long drag of his cigar, and muttered, "Y'all picked the wrong trucker to mess with today." Billy Bob didn't slow down as the battered Rustbucket soared deeper into the asteroid field. Alarms were blaring from every corner of the cockpit, but he barely acknowledged them. A spiderweb of cracks spread across the main viewport, the stars beyond shimmering like they were underwater. He glanced at the flickering radar screen and let out a low whistle. More blips than he could count were closing in on his position, and that could only mean one thing: the Skeltari weren't retreating. They were doubling down. Somewhere in the swirling chaos of tumbling rocks, the pirate mothership was repositioning, herding him toward a choke point where escape would be near impossible. Billy Bob grinned, a dangerous glint in his eye. He tapped the console with one calloused finger, whispering, "I reckon it's time to give 'em something they won't forget." Below deck, hidden under piles of junk and spare parts, the real heart of the Rustbucket hummed to life. It wasn't standard-issue cargo tech. It was a relic of an older, wilder time, a prototype gravity sling, half-assembled by drunken engineers who had dared Billy Bob to smuggle it off a military scrapyard. It wasn't exactly safe, it sure as hell wasn't stable, but it had one advantage nobody could deny. It could hurl a ship across short distances almost instantly, ignoring most conventional laws of motion. He pulled the lever with a grunt. Deep inside the ship, old generators sputtered and screamed to life, flooding the cabin with a harsh red glow. The ship began to shake violently, bolts rattling free from the walls, overhead panels crashing to the floor. Billy Bob tightened his harness, gritting his teeth as the engines roared louder than thunder. Outside, the Skeltari fighters swarmed tighter, expecting their prey to falter any second. They formed a perfect net, cutting off every escape path with professional precision. They didn't realize they weren't trapping a cornered rat. They were about to get stomped by a wild bull. With a sound like a building collapsing, the gravity sling discharged. The Rustbucket shot forward at an impossible speed, slicing through the pirate net like a bullet through glass. One unlucky fighter clipped his wing on the tail end of Billy's ship and spun into an asteroid, erupting in a fireball that briefly illuminated the twisted ballet of rocks and debris around them. Billy Bob howled with laughter as the ship shuddered and pitched wildly from the G-forces. Instruments exploded in a shower of sparks, and the hull groaned like it was going to tear itself apart, but the Rustbucket didn't stop. She just kept screaming forward, carving a path of chaos through the asteroid field. Behind him, the pirate ships scrambled to adjust, their tight formation shredded, their leader barking orders too late to matter. In the mothership's command center, Commander Crix was losing control. His slender claws dug trenches into the armrest of his command throne as he bellowed for pursuit. His lieutenants scrambled to comply, but without formation, they were nothing more than easy targets for the debris-strewn hell the human had dragged them into. Crix's second-in-command, a shrewd old strategist named Velka, hissed in his ear, "Commander, we must retreat. This human is mad. He will destroy us all." Crix shoved him aside with a snarl, spittle flying as he screamed, "No retreat! That ship is an insult to our dominance. Crush it!" Meanwhile, Billy Bob wrestled with the controls as the ship's battered systems fought to stay online. Warnings flashed faster than he could read them. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. The Rustbucket was strong, but she wasn't invincible. Already, he could hear the telltale whine of an overheating reactor, the faint smell of burning metal filling the cockpit. He needed a plan, and fast. His eyes flicked to a nearby cluster of massive asteroids slowly rotating in lazy orbits around a common center of mass. It looked like a miniature solar system, with debris and dust swirling between them. It was beautiful in a deadly sort of way. To any sane man, it would have looked like certain death. But to Billy Bob, it looked like an opportunity. He grinned and throttled the ship toward the cluster, manually overriding every automated safety protocol. The Rustbucket dove into the swirling chaos, weaving between spinning boulders the size of houses. The Skeltari fighters hesitated, unused to chasing prey into environments where one mistake meant instant obliteration. That hesitation cost them. Billy Bob activated the last of his EMP mines, tossing them behind him like breadcrumbs. The mines detonated in uneven, chaotic pulses, sending shockwaves that knocked several fighters off course, straight into waiting asteroids. One by one, the pursuing ships were picked off, battered into wreckage by the very field they thought would trap him. Billy Bob whooped, spinning the rust bucket through a gap barely wider than the ship itself, scraping paint and leaving a trail of broken bits behind him. "Ain't nothin' like a good old-fashioned death race," he shouted to no one, slapping the dashboard affectionately. By the time he emerged from the far side of the asteroid cluster, there were only a few pirate ships left, battered and limping. The mothership hung back at the edge of the field, unwilling to risk the hazards. Billy Bob slowed the ship just enough to send a transmission, opening a wide broadcast channel so every Skeltari could hear. He leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, cigar smoke curling lazily around him, and drawled in a voice thick with amusement, "Next time y'all want to rob a trucker, pick someone who ain't got nothin' to lose." He cut the transmission and punched the throttle again, the rust bucket lurching forward, battered but unbowed, leaving the stunned pirates drifting helplessly behind him in the vast, uncaring void. The rust bucket limped along through deep space, battered and bruised from the asteroid gauntlet but very much alive. Inside, Billy Bob was half jogging, half staggering down the central corridor, extinguishing small fires with a portable extinguisher he had duct-taped to his arm. Panels hung loose from the ceiling, wires sparked dangerously, and the whole ship smelled like a barbecue gone wrong. But Billy Bob whistled a cheerful tune, the extinguisher hissing rhythmically as he doused flame after flame. He wasn't worried. The rust bucket had been through worse, and somehow she always managed to pull through. It was just a matter of patching her up and convincing her to keep flying a little longer. Reaching the engine room, he kicked aside a fallen beam and stared at the chaos. The gravity sling was shot, the reactor was running dangerously hot, and half the secondary systems were either offline or critically damaged. Billy scratched his head, muttered something about needing more duct tape and chewing gum, and set to work. Outside, the few remaining Skeltari fighters regrouped, hovering like vultures at the edges of sensor range. They weren't attacking yet, just watching, waiting. Maybe they thought he was crippled. Maybe they hoped he'd surrender. Billy Bob grinned as he tightened a bolt with a wrench nearly half his size. Let him hope. Hope was a funny thing out here in the black. It could keep a man going when all seemed lost, or it could betray him, gut him like a fish when he least expected it. Billy had learned a long time ago not to rely on hope. Only grit, stubbornness, and a good wrench could be trusted. As he patched together coolant lines with scraps of old tubing, a warning light flickered to life on the main console. Incoming hail. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a greasy sleeve and lumbered back toward the cockpit. Slumping into the pilot's chair, he accepted the hail, and the cracked, angry visage of Commander Crix filled the screen. The Skeltari's thin face was twisted in fury, and his voice was a high-pitched screech that rattled the speakers. "Human! You have defied the great Skeltari Dominion. You will surrender immediately, or face total annihilation." Billy Bob tilted his hat back, chewed thoughtfully on the end of an unlit cigar, and said, "Now, I might be a simple trucker, but I reckon it's a mite premature to be talkin' about annihilation when y'all couldn't even catch me with 100 ships." Crix's face turned an alarming shade of purple, and he sputtered, clearly unused to such casual disrespect. Billy leaned closer to the screen, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "Tell ya what, partner. Why don't y'all turn around, tuck that ugly tail between your legs, and find someone else to pick on? 'Cause I ain't in the mood for dyin' today, and if you keep pokin' the bear, you ain't gonna like what happens." Crix screamed something unintelligible and cut the transmission. Billy Bob chuckled and flicked a few switches, rerouting auxiliary power to the shields. He didn't know if they'd hold, but it didn't much matter. The Skeltari would be coming now, all teeth and claws. And he'd be ready. He bolted down the cockpit controls and hustled to the weapons locker, a rusted, dented metal cabinet bolted to the floor. Inside, among a clutter of grease guns, outdated laser rifles, and one antique revolver, he found what he was looking for, a box labeled "Big Boom, Handle with Care." He hefted it with a grunt and dragged it back to the engine room, heart pounding with excitement. This wasn't just any bomb. It was an old mining charge, designed to crack open planetoids and expose valuable ore veins. Highly illegal in most sectors, incredibly dangerous, and exactly the kind of wild card Billy Bob needed. He strapped it to a maintenance drone, patched in a remote detonator, and whispered, "Fly true, little buddy." The drone whirred to life, blinking a cheerful blue as it zipped out the airlock and into open space. Back in the cockpit, Billy Bob watched the radar. The Skeltari were advancing, cautious but determined. He smiled grimly and guided the drone into the middle of their formation, threading it through the blind spots between sensor sweeps. It was delicate work, and more than once he nearly got spotted, but finally the drone was in position. Billy wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, flexed his fingers, and hit the detonator. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the void lit up with an explosion brighter than 1,000 suns. The blast wave vaporized 3 fighters instantly, sent a dozen more spinning out of control, and threw the rest into panicked disarray. Billy whooped and slapped the dashboard in glee as the Skeltari formation crumbled. Their communication channels erupted with frantic screams and desperate orders. In the confusion, he punched the Rustbucket's engines to full, aiming for a narrow corridor in the debris. The battered ship shuddered and groaned but pushed forward, slipping past wreckage and flaming husks. On the Skeltari bridge, Commander Crix watched in horror as his forces collapsed. Velka, his second-in-command, grabbed his shoulder and snarled, "It is over, fool. Withdraw or die." Crix hesitated, pride warring with survival instinct. Finally, with a roar of pure frustration, he ordered a full retreat. Billy Bob didn't look back as he cleared the last of the wreckage. He didn't have to. The Rustbucket was still flying, and he was still alive. That was victory enough. He slumped back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. "Ain't nothin' quite like a day's work done proper," he muttered. Somewhere out there, the galaxy's most feared pirate fleet had just been outfoxed by a space trucker with duct tape, a broken ship, and a stubborn refusal to die. He grinned, pulled out his battered harmonica, and played a slow, lazy tune as the stars stretched out before him, infinite and waiting. The stars shimmered outside the cracked viewport of the Rustbucket as Billy Bob set the autopilot to drift mode, allowing the ship a rare moment of peace. The damage to the engines was worse than he thought, and they were now coasting along at sublight speeds toward the nearest friendly outpost, still several days away. Billy leaned back in the rickety pilot's chair, tipping his hat low over his eyes, when the proximity alarm blared to life. He sat bolt upright, heart thudding. Slamming a fist onto the console, he silenced the alarm and squinted at the readout. Something was out there. No heat signature, no transponder ID. Just a dark mass, hanging motionless in space, directly in their path. Billy cursed under his breath. Couldn't be more pirates. Not this far out. And it didn't look like a Skeltari ship, either. Curious, he rerouted the last functional camera drone and sent it toward the object. The image flickered to life on the main screen, showing a hulking, twisted wreck of what must have once been a massive cruiser. Ancient. Abandoned. Covered in black scoring marks and strange, organic growths. Billy felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He'd heard stories of ghost ships drifting out in the dark, cursed relics from wars so old even the Galactic archives barely remembered them. The Rustbucket was on a collision course. No way to steer around it, not with the engines in their current state. Only one option: dock with the wreck and scavenge parts to repair his own ship. Billy grunted, grabbed his tool belt, and suited up. The airlock opened with a reluctant groan, and he propelled himself across the void with short bursts from his suit thrusters, landing with a soft clang on the derelict's outer hull. Up close, the ship was even more disturbing. Strange symbols were carved into the metal, and dark stains hinted at battles fought in the vacuum long ago. Billy tightened his grip on his plasma cutter and moved forward, cutting into a side hatch that refused to open. Inside, the wreck was a tomb. Long-abandoned corridors stretched into darkness, their walls slick with some kind of resin. Billy moved carefully, every footstep echoing unervingly. His helmet light played over broken weapons, shattered armor, and the skeletal remains of long-dead crewmen. Most weren't human, elongated limbs, too many fingers, faces frozen in eternal screams. Billy swallowed hard and pushed deeper inside. He wasn't here for sightseeing. He needed a working power core, or at least some functional drive components. Anything to get the Rustbucket moving again before something worse than bad luck found him. As he navigated the twisted remains of what might have been a cargo bay, he spotted a glimmer of promise, an intact auxiliary reactor tucked behind a collapsed wall. It would take some doing to free it, but it was small enough to haul back to the Rustbucket. Billy knelt to inspect it, running quick diagnostics through his wrist pad. Surprisingly, the unit still had residual power. That meant he could jumpstart his ship systems, assuming he lived long enough to install it. A scraping noise behind him made him spin around, plasma cutter raised. In the shifting shadows, he caught a glimpse of movement. Something low to the ground. Skittering. Watching. Billy backed toward the reactor, never taking his eyes off the darkness. His breathing sounded loud inside the helmet. Whatever was in here, it wasn't just debris or automated defenses. Something had survived. And it wasn't friendly. With fumbling hands, he attached the grappler line to the reactor and sent the signal for remote retrieval. The line hissed as it reeled the unit slowly toward the breached hull and the waiting Rustbucket. Billy turned to follow it but froze as the shadows ahead shifted again, this time coalescing into a form. Tall. Insectal. Eyes like burning coals locked onto him, and the creature let out a rasping hiss that reverberated through the ship's ruined halls. Billy didn't wait for introductions. He fired the plasma cutter, sending a jet of molten energy lancing toward the creature. It shrieked and flinched back, but more shapes stirred in the darkness. The derelict wasn't abandoned, it was infested. And he was smack in the middle of their nest. He sprinted, boots pounding on metal grates, as the things gave chase. They were fast. Too fast. One slashed at him with a barbed limb, ripping a gash across his suit's outer layer. Air hissed out in a thin, deadly leak. Alarm screamed in his helmet, but Billy kept running, slapping a patch over the breach as he barreled through the wreckage. He reached the breach point where the reactor was being hauled through the gap to his ship. Without thinking, he clipped onto the grappler line and activated emergency retrieval. The line yanked him bodily off his feet, pulling him through the vacuum as the infested creatures slashed at the air behind him. He tumbled end over end through space, limbs flailing, before crashing into the side of the Rustbucket. Scrambling, he hauled himself inside and slammed the airlock controls. The doors sealed with a final blessed clang, cutting off the nightmarish screeches from outside. Panting, Billy ripped off his helmet and collapsed against the wall, heart hammering so loud he could barely hear the ship systems whining in protest. But he was alive. The reactor was secured. And if he worked fast, he could get the Rustbucket moving again before anything else decided to come poking around. Billy pushed himself to his feet, cracked his knuckles, and muttered, "Ain't no bug gonna keep a trucker from finishin' his run." He grabbed his tools and set to work, determined to patch up the old girl one more time. Out here in the dark, survival wasn't about strength. It was about grit. And Billy Bob had more grit than any monster lurking in the black.